The Independent Electoral Commission welcoming the newly signed Electoral Amendment Bill of 2022. That piece of legislation provides the IEC with guidelines for the inclusion of independent candidates. It was reworked following a constitutional court ruling that declared some parts of the previous Electoral Act unconstitutional. So what lies ahead for the country's electoral agency as we count down to the polls next year? And of course, those polls now just months away. Let's bring in IEC Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, that's Masego Sheburi, who joins us via our telephone line this morning. Great to have you on the program, sir. Thanks for making time. You know, as you and I speak, the President has been criticized for not sending this bill to the Constitutional Court first before signing it into law in order to test its constitutional muster. In fact, some people seeing it as a missed opportunity. What's your response to that?
As we understand it, the Act intends to do one thing, i.e. to accommodate the participation of adult citizens in election of provincial legislatures and the National Assembly without them being required to be members of a political party. The Parliament also recognized that there was a call from certain sectors of society for greater electoral reform beyond just accommodating independence. To that extent, the Act institutionalizes a mechanism to have broader electoral reform beyond 2024, but before the next general elections in 2029. So there is a mechanism to review the Act as it currently stands for a debate on broader electoral reform. As we understood it, Parliament only amended the Act to bring it in line with the ruling of the Constitutional Court in 2020, i.e. to include independent candidates.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll agree, though, that that inclusion has to be meaningful for it to be impactful at any rate. I don't think the Constitutional Court was also gesturing at an inclusion of independent candidates just for the sake of inclusion's sake. And in fact, that's what those organizations that are heading to court are pushing back against.
Parliament has made policy choices that are now part of the Act, and until that is changed, we are duty-bound to plan for an election in terms of the Act as it currently exists.
Right. How worried are you, though, that the back and forth and the litigation around this may ironically rob the IEC of the time it doesn't have?
Indeed, we are worried for the following reason. Any level of uncertainty creates doubt in the psyche of the voting public, and it may have an impact on voter turnout. On our part, we wish that we can procure clarity as soon as possible that if the matter eventually goes to court, the court pronounces at the earliest opportune moment. We are on record already last year having said that any electoral system that is introduced now will not be practical for implementation in 2024 because we know from a previous ruling of the Constitutional Court that a general election may under no circumstance be deferred or postponed. So we are planning on the basis that we must hold an election before the end of August next year.
It's a difficult position for the IEC to be in. I can appreciate that because, I mean, on the one hand, I totally get it. You have specific timelines. I think you need 18 months at the very least to prepare for an election that won't have issues afterwards. But on the other hand, you may very well be working with an act that is ultimately declared unconstitutional. How do you work between those two difficult positions?
We have tried to anticipate as much as possible what was in the bill. Now that the bill has been enacted into law, we are planning on the basis of that being the framework for an election in next year. So if aspects of the Act are declared unconstitutional by the court, we have no option but to abide and amend our program to accord with what the court would have ordered. However, we want to caution that if the court rules indeed that the aspect of the bill may be unconstitutional, whatever the court orders may not be possible for implementation given the current understanding that an election must be held by 2024.
So are you anticipating some kind of suspended ruling?
We will have to wait and see what the court says, but we know from 2021 that the court ruled that a general election may not be postponed under any other circumstances. That is the basis on which we are claiming that an election must happen come 2024.
Sure. All right, let's hone in on some of, the details around how you envision this act in its current form can be implemented if, in fact, we do go ahead under its guidelines. Part of what the IEC was able to communicate yesterday is that for an independent candidate to be eligible for a seat in the National Assembly or the National Council of Provinces, they essentially have to get 15% of the voter support for that particular seat from last year's election, or from the preceding election, I should say. What informed that figure as a start?
Okay, let's deal with the nuances first. The
Sure.
first one, the 15% that you're referencing, is a requirement that independent candidates, including parties that do not have representation in legislatures or National Assembly, must meet to be able to contest, to appear on the ballot paper. So they must meet at least 15% of votes that would have constituted a quota in the last election. For an independent candidate and or a party candidate to obtain a seat, they must meet the threshold. The threshold is determined by taking the total valid votes divided by the number of seats in that legislative assembly. So the seats, though the number of votes required to get a seat will only be known once an election has been held. But what you referenced as 15% are the requirements for candidates, whether independent or those nominated by parties that don't have representation, have to meet before their names appear on the ballot paper.
And of course, the concern about that is whether or not that's fair, right? So essentially, the requirements for someone who's an independent candidate and those who are part of organizations are the same.
Indeed, the rationale is universally accepted that for a person to stand as a candidate, there must be some demonstration that they have support and that their participation is not frivolous. Because if you don't have any requirements for entry, you may end up with an unwieldy ballot paper that makes it difficult for voters to make a choice on an informed basis or to find their candidate among an unending list of candidates.
Another concern, of course, from those who are contemplating litigation is this idea that all votes are equal, irrespective of who you actually decide to back. So let's say there's a scenario where there's an independent candidate who is very popular, for lack of a better term, and is able to meet the threshold multiple times. Yesterday, this question was posed to the IEC about whether or not that candidate would essentially have, let's call it, control over multiple seats in the National Assembly. The response to that was no. So what happens then to that vote of confidence by the constituencies that they've placed in this particular candidate if they can, as a maximum, only occupy one seat in Parliament?
The participation of independents is well established in our scheme. In local government, we have independent contesting. And because you are an individual, you can only be elected to a single seat. So a popular candidate who has more votes than they require for a seat, they will be assigned the seat. And by so doing, their political rights guaranteed in Section 19 of the Constitution are validated, and the other seats are discarded because they can't aggregate, they have not submitted a list. An independent can only but occupy a single seat. So if you get more votes than you require, you are given a seat and the other votes are discarded in the second allocation.
Doesn't that disincentivize people from voting for independent candidates in case their votes are ultimately discarded?
That is true for all political contestants. A party that receives more votes than it has a quota, more than the quota, and those votes do not count in the second allocation, they also lose those votes. So The phenomenon of wasted votes is not only true for independent candidates, but if a candidate is popular and they get seats that are beyond the threshold, in that case, there may be a case to be made that the candidate may be disadvantaged. But it is a function of a choice that a person makes to stand either as an independent or as an association. And by association, it means you will be able to aggregate those votes and get the benefit of your popularity.
I hear you, but I'm sure you'll also agree that that risk is more pronounced for independent candidates than it is for any other political organization that's got multiple people for whom you can aggregate some of those votes.
Indeed, and that's why the law does not require a person to form a party. You can form an association and call it whatever you want if you want to aggregate the votes. But if you stand as an independent, you may only be elected to a single seat.
And that essentially, it sounds to me like just ostensibly operating like a party, isn't it? Whether you call it a party or association, if it works in the same way, it probably is the same thing.
If a person thinks that they are popular, they are going to get more votes than just one seat, it might just be a way to consider in order to aggregate the vote and benefit from their popularity.
All right. Interesting times ahead. Masego Sheburi, thanks for speaking to us. Appreciate your, I suppose, explaining from your vantage point how you reckon this will unfold. But to be fair, this really does lie in Parliament and the Constitutional Court's hands, the IEC effectively having to implement what's before them. So, Masego Sheburi, thanks for your time. He's the Deputy CEO of the Independent Electoral Commission.